The rise of consumerism and mass production was not a cultural accident or a marketing conspiracy. It was a structural transformation in how economies solved the problem of abundance. When I look back at this shift, I do not begin with advertising slogans or shopping malls, but with a far older anxiety that haunted every pre-industrial society's scarcity. For most of human history, economies struggled not to sell goods, but to produce enough of them. Consumption was constrained by survival. Production was limited by muscle weather and time. Wealth expressed itself not through choice, but through insulation from shortage. The world that would eventually celebrate consumption first had to escape the fear that tomorrow might not provide. Before mass production, consumption was local, seasonal, and socially bounded. Most people consumed what they or their neighbors produced. Clothing was mended tools, repaired food, preserved. Demand was shaped by necessity rather than desire. In such a world, conspicuous consumption existed only among elites, and even then it was symbolic rather than expansive. Luxury signaled status, not lifestyle. The economy's central challenge was output, not persuasion. Markets were narrow because production was narrow, and there was little need to convince people to buy what did not yet exist in excess. The Industrial Revolution changed this balance with startling speed. Mechanization multiplied output beyond local demand. Factories did not merely make goods cheaper, they made them plentiful. For the first time, economies confronted a new and destabilizing question. What happens when production outpaces basic need? This was not immediately celebrated. Early industrial societies were deeply ambivalent about abundance. Overproduction triggered crises, warehouses filled, prices collapsed. Workers lost jobs because machines could produce more than markets could absorb. The paradox of plenty emerged. The capacity to produce wealth outstripped the capacity to distribute it sustainably. Mass production therefore required a companion revolution in consumption. Goods alone were not enough. Buyers had to be created. Wages rose slowly but unevenly. Credit expanded to bridge the gap. Installment plans allowed workers to consume before they could afford. Department stores transformed shopping from transaction into experience. Branding differentiated identical goods, attaching identity to objects. Advertising reframed consumption not as indulgence, but as participation in modern life. This was not manipulation imposed from above. It was a systemic adaptation. An economy built on scale needed demand that could scale with it. The early 20th century marked the consolidation of this new model. Henry Ford's assembly line is often cited as a triumph of efficiency, but its deeper significance lay elsewhere. Ford paid workers enough to buy the cars they produced. This was not generosity, it was logic. Mass production required mass consumers. Productivity gains had to be recycled into purchasing power, or the system would choke on its own output. Consumerism thus emerged not as cultural excess, but as economic necessity. Growth became circular production, created income, fueled consumption, justified further production. This circularity transformed society itself. Consumption ceased to be merely about use and became about identity. What one bought began to signal who one was, not just what one needed. This shift unsettled older moral frameworks. Thrift, once a virtue, now threatened demand. Saving too much became economically dangerous. Economies quietly inverted their values. Spending was encouraged as civic contribution. Consumption became patriotism during wartime mobilization and post-war reconstruction. To buy was to sustain employment growth and stability. The post-World War II period represents the high point of this synthesis. Mass production met mass consumption under conditions of rising wages, strong unions, and expanding welfare states. Appliances, automobiles, Suburban housing and standardized lifestyles defined prosperity. Advertising promised not survival, but fulfillment. Credit normalized future income as present purchasing power. The middle class became the engine of demand, and consumer confidence became a macroeconomic variable. This was the golden age of consumer capitalism, when abundance felt benign and progress felt shared. Yet history insists that this model carried contradictions from the beginning. Mass production thrives on standardization. Consumerism thrives on differentiation. To keep factories running, products had to be replaced faster than they wore out. Planned obsolescence emerged not as cynicism, but as necessity. Fashion cycles shortened. Desire had to be refreshed continually. Waste became structural. Environmental cost was externalized. Debt quietly replaced income growth as the lubricant of consumption. What had begun as a solution to overproduction gradually became a source of fragility. By the late 20th century, consumerism had globalized. Production migrated to lower-cost regions. Consumption concentrated in wealthier societies. Advertising became psychological rather than informational. Brands sold lifestyles rather than goods. Mass production no longer meant national factories feeding national consumers, but global supply chains feeding abstract demand. The distance between producer and consumer widened dramatically. Labor became invisible. Environmental impact became diffuse. Consumption felt effortless precisely because its costs were displaced elsewhere. This distance altered the psychology of economies. Consumption became less about need and more about reassurance status and distraction. Growth depended increasingly on convincing people to replace what they already owned. Financial systems adapted accordingly. Credit expanded further. Asset inflation substituted for wage growth. Consumer confidence became fragile, swinging with markets rather than material security. History shows us that when consumption is fueled by expectation rather than income, downturns become sharper and recoveries more dependent on intervention. And it is here at the point where mass production has mastered abundance and consumerism has mastered desire that the system confronts its deepest tension, because an economy built on continuous consumption must either expand endlessly or redefine what prosperity means. And as environmental limits, inequality, and psychological fatigue converge, the rise of consumerism and mass production begins to look less like a triumph and more like a transitional phase in a longer economic story that is now searching for a new balance as the age of abundance collides with the limits of planet patience and purpose, and the narrative moves toward that balance. Because history suggests that consumerism does not end with collapse, but with transformation. When societies reach the limits of material expansion, they begin slowly, unevenly to renegotiate what consumption is for. This moment has arrived before, though never at today's scale. In earlier eras, scarcity forced restraint. In the modern era, abundance forces choice. The question is no longer how to produce more, but how to define enough, without destabilizing systems built on perpetual demand. In the late 20th and early 21st centuries, signs of this transition became visible. Growth continued, but satisfaction did not rise in tandem. Consumption accelerated, yet anxiety followed close behind. Advertising shifted from promises of utility to promises of meaning. Products were no longer sold for what they did, but for how they made people feel healthy, ethical, unique, responsible. This was not hypocrisy, it was adaptation. As material needs were largely met for many, the economy searched for new sources of desire. Experience replaced ownership. Services replaced goods. Identity replaced necessity. Mass production quietly evolved into mass customization, an attempt to preserve scale while simulating individuality. At the same time, cracks in the old model widened. Environmental degradation exposed the physical cost of endless throughput. Climate change made clear that mass production's externalities were no longer external. Debt-driven consumption revealed its fragility during crises when confidence evaporated faster than goods could be sold. Inequality undermined the circular logic of mass demand, as too much purchasing power concentrated at the top where marginal consumption was low. History reminds us that systems built on broad participation cannot survive extreme concentration for long. States and firms responded, as they always have, by experimenting. Circular economies, sustainability metrics, sharing platforms, and digital goods emerged not as moral awakenings alone, but as economic necessity. When selling more objects became costly, or unviable value shifted toward longevity, reuse, and immaterial consumption. Software, media, and subscriptions scaled without material throughput. Attention replaced inventory. Yet even here, history cautions us. New models do not abolish old pressures. They relocate them. Data extraction replaces resource extraction. Psychological fatigue replaces physical scarcity. The problem of limits returns in another form. What makes this transition historically significant is that it challenges the deepest assumption of industrial capitalism that prosperity must be visible, tangible, and ever-expanding. Earlier societies measured wealth in land grain and factories. The consumer age measured it in goods owned. The emerging era struggles to measure it at all. Well-being, security, and sustainability resist simple accounting. This creates political tension because systems of production are easier to manage than systems of restraint. History shows that redefining prosperity is harder than expanding it, and yet there is precedent for cautious optimism. Past transitions from agrarian to industrial, from industrial to consumer, were chaotic, contested, and uneven. They produced backlash as well as progress, but they also expanded human capability in unexpected ways. The rise of consumerism solved the problem of industrial overcapacity by democratizing comfort and convenience. Its transformation may now solve a different problem: how to sustain economic coordination without exhausting people or planet. The long arc of mass production and consumerism, therefore, reveals not a moral failure, but an evolutionary stage. It emerged to absorb abundance and organize demand at scale. It flourished when wages, credit, and optimism aligned. It strained when its assumptions hardened into entitlement. Like every system before it, it now faces the test of adaptation. History suggests it will not disappear, but it will be reshaped, less uniform, more contested, and more consciously constrained. If this journey through the rise of consumerism and mass production has changed how you view consumption growth and progress, I invite you to subscribe and continue these historical explorations with me, and to leave a comment sharing whether you believe the future of consumption lies in less, better, or simply different, because history reminds us that economies do not collapse when desires change, but when systems refuse to recognize that they have already begun to